Deep in the frozen waste of the mountaintops of the giants, a corpse hangs crucified beneath a swirling red star, and almost nobody who plays Elden Ring stops to ask what that star actually is, where it came from, or why it's the only object of its kind in the entire game. The Blood Star. If you've spent any real time in the mountaintops of the giants, you've seen it. A dull, pulsing red star fixed in the sky above the corpse of a giant, chained and crucified in the snow, positioned almost directly beneath it like the two are locked in some kind of silent conversation that's been going on since before the shattering. Most players walk past it. It doesn't have a boss attached to it. It doesn't gate progress. It doesn't hand you an item when you interact with it, at least not directly. It's just there, hanging in a sky that's otherwise full of ordinary, unremarkable stars, doing something that no other star in the game does. It's red. And in a game where color is never just color, where the developers at From Software have spent 3 separate titles using red specifically to signal blood, corruption, madness, or divine transgression, a red star sitting in isolation above a crucified giant corpse is not a background detail, it's a thesis statement. It's the game quietly telling you that something happened here, something involving blood on a scale large enough to stain the heavens themselves, and it's daring you to go find out what. So that's what we're going to do. Over the course of this video, we're going to take the Blood Star apart, piece by piece. We're going to look at where it sits in the sky, what it's positioned above, what game mechanics are tied to it, what item descriptions mention it by name, and what the broader cosmology of the lands between says about stars, blood, and the horrifying possibility that the two are not as separate as they first appear. We're going to walk through every major theory the community has built around it, weigh them against each other, and by the end, you're going to understand why this single decorative object in the sky might be one of the most quietly unsettling pieces of environmental storytelling From Software has ever put into a game. Before we get into the theories, let's just sit with the object itself for a moment, because the placement alone is doing an enormous amount of work. The Blood Star hangs in the sky above the mountaintops of the giants, specifically visible from the region around the Church of Repose, and extending toward the Forge of the Giants. It's most strikingly framed above the crucified giant corpse near the Church of Repose, a body nailed and chained in a pose that unmistakably evokes crucifixion, hanging exposed to the cold with its arms extended, as if displayed rather than simply killed. Above it, the Blood Star burns a dull crimson against a black sky, distinct from every other star field in the game. This isn't a subtle effect. From Software's environmental artists are meticulous about skywork across all of their titles, and the choice to render exactly one star in a different color, in a specific fixed position, above a specific crucified body is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. Skyboxes in Elden Ring are static assets tied to specific regions. Someone made a deliberate decision to put a red star exactly there, and no game design decision at this level of specificity happens without intention. The giant beneath it matters too. The fire giants and their kin are among the oldest beings referenced in Elden Ring's cosmology, predating even the Golden Order in most interpretations of the lore, tied to primeval flame and to the earliest wars fought in the lands between. Crucifying one, chaining it, displaying it beneath a bleeding star, reads less like an execution and more like a ritual. Executions are quick. Displays are meant to be seen, meant to send a message, meant to last. The Church of Repose sits nearby, itself associated with rune sorceries and, notably, with the constellation incantations that let players summon meteors and comets down from the heavens themselves. That's not a coincidental neighbor. The game is placing star magic, a crucified primordial giant, and a bleeding red star within visual and thematic range of each other, and asking you to draw a line between them. So what is the line? Let's start with the most literal reading, the one that requires the least speculative leap, and build outward from there into the stranger territory. The most straightforward theory, and probably the majority position among lore analysts who've spent real time on this, is that the Blood Star is not a star in any astronomical sense at all. It's a symbol, or possibly a magical manifestation, tied directly to the death of the giant crucified beneath it, in this reading. The star isn't burning red because of some cosmic event happening light years away. It's burning red because of what happened directly underneath it, on the ground, to that specific giant. The blood, metaphorically or even literally, rose. It stained the heavens the way a stain spreads outward from its source. The star isn't causing the blood is causing the star. This reading has some real support if you look at how Elden Ring treats the relationship between the earthly and the cosmic elsewhere in its lore. The Golden Order itself is built on the idea that events on the ground can reshape the fundamental laws of the universe, that the Elden Ring, an object, an artifact you can physically find and touch and carry, dictates the rules of death, rebirth, an order for the entire world. If a single rune can rewrite death itself, it's not a stretch to suggest that a sufficiently significant act of violence, the crucifixion and death of a primordial giant, could leave a visible mark on the sky above it. The lands between doesn't separate the metaphysical from the physical the way our world does. Stars in this setting aren't just balls of gas burning at a comfortable distance. They're active participants in the setting's magic system, and if magic can flow up from the ground into the stars, then the reverse implication is uncomfortable but consistent. Something happened to that giant that was cosmic in scale, even if the giant itself was very much a physical, earthly being. But if that's true, it raises a harder question. One that the "it's just a symbol" reading doesn't fully answer. Why would the death of one giant, however significant, warrant a permanent scar on the sky? Giants die. The fire giant you fight as a boss dies right in front of you, and no new red star appears afterward. So if this crucified giant's death is what caused the blood star, what makes this specific giant's death different from every other giant death in the setting? That's where the theory needs a second layer. And this is where things start to get genuinely unsettling. The second layer of this theory points toward the Formless Mother, and if you've watched enough Bloodborne lore content, that name probably just made something click. Miyazaki and the writing team at From Software have a well-documented habit of letting concepts echo between games without ever making the connection explicit, because explicit connections would collapse the multiverse ambiguity they clearly want to preserve. But the echoes are there if you know where to look, and the Bloodstar has echoes running straight back to Bloodborne's cosmic horror. In Bloodborne, the Great Ones are cosmic beings, vast intelligences that exist partially outside normal reality, and one of the central horrors of that game is the idea that blood itself can be a conduit to something beyond human comprehension. The old blood isn't just a healing resource or a currency. It's implied, repeatedly, through item descriptions and environmental storytelling, to be a substance with its own agency, its own hunger, capable of transforming the people who use it into something less than human, and occasionally into something that isn't human at all anymore. The blood-starved beast, the orphan of Kos, the entire concept of kin transformation, all of it stems from the idea that blood, in sufficient concentration, stops being biology and starts being metaphysics. If Elden Ring is drawing from that same well, even loosely, even as a thematic echo rather than a direct crossover, then a star made of blood isn't just a poetic image. It's potentially a cosmic entity in its own right, or a fragment of one, or a wound in the fabric of the setting's cosmology, where something vast and blood-hungry is pressing up against the world from the outside. This reading transforms the blood star from a monument into a threat. It's not commemorating what happened to the giant. It's still happening. The giant isn't a memorial. The giant might be food, or a conduit, or an anchor point, holding something in place or holding something back. This is where we need to talk about the Mohgwyn dynasty, because if there's one force in Elden Ring's world that treats blood as an active cosmic substance, rather than a passive biological one, it's Mohg, Lord of Blood, and the formless mother he serves. Mohg's entire storyline revolves around blood as a religious and magical force with its own will. The formless mother, an entity Mohg venerates, is described in vague, almost deliberately unclear terms across item descriptions. But the through line is consistent. Blood, in the Mohgwyn tradition, is not inert. It moves with purpose. The Mohgwyn dynasty mausoleum is soaked, literally soaked, in a lake of blood that has its own gravity, its own pull on the narrative, culminating in Miquella's cocoon being submerged in it and Mohg's entire boss arena built around a massive blood geyser that erupts with what can only be described as ritual violence. If you accept that blood in this setting can behave like an active force rather than a passive substance, the idea of a star made of blood hanging over a crucified giant stops sounding metaphorical and starts sounding literal. The giant isn't a symbol of something. The giant might be an ingredient. This connects to a specific piece of item-flavored text that a lot of players miss entirely, because it's easy to miss. The giant's crest talisman and related giant-associated equipment carry descriptions that gesture toward the fire giant's rule in the setting's oldest wars fought before the Golden Order rose to prominence. wars that involve the primeval flame the giants still guard at the forge. Some lore analysts have connected the crucified giant specifically to punishment for a transgression against that primeval flame. A giant who did something, gave something away, or failed to protect something, and was crucified as consequence. If that's the correct read, the blood star isn't commemorating a natural death. It's marking an execution for a crime we, the player, are never directly told about, and the blood that stained the sky is punishment made visible. A cosmic scar left specifically so that every giant who looks up sees exactly what happens to those who fail their duty. That's theory 1, broadly speaking, the symbolic consequence reading. And even within that single theory, there are at least 3 distinct sub-branches. Pure symbolism with no active cosmic force involved, a Bloodborne adjacent cosmic horror reading where the star is an entity or a wound, and a punishment reading tied to a specific transgression against the primeval flame. All 3 are defensible from the text, none of them are confirmed. And that ambiguity, frustrating as it might be if you want a clean answer, is exactly the kind of ambiguity From Software writes into their games on purpose, because certainty would collapse the horror. The moment you know exactly what the blood star is, it stops being unsettling and starts being just another piece of lore trivia. The game wants you to sit in the not knowing. Let's move to the second major theory, because this one takes a very different approach to the same object, and it starts not with the giant beneath the star, but with the stars themselves, and what stars mean in Elden Ring's broader cosmology. Stars are not decoration in this setting. That's worth establishing clearly before we go further, because it's easy to treat the sky as background art, something the environment team rendered to make the world feel alive, without any deeper mechanical or narrative weight. But Elden Ring's stars are tied directly into one of its most important and most cryptic magic systems, the primeval current, sometimes called the Dark Moon or the astrological sorceries associated with Selen, Rena, and the Carian royal family. Comet Azure, one of the most powerful sorceries in the game, is described as channeling the power of a star itself. Meteorite staffs, the constellation-based incantations found near the Church of Repose, the entire lineage of astrology-based magic running through Carian sorcery, all of it treats the stars as a literal source of power that can be drawn down and weaponized. Stars in the lands between are not passive lights, they're batteries, they're conduits. They're, in some interpretations, dormant or distant entities whose power can be borrowed by anyone with the right ritual knowledge. If that's the baseline rule for how stars function in this setting, then a red star, a star that looks fundamentally different from every other star in the sky, is not a cosmetic variant. It's a different kind of power source entirely, or a corrupted version of the standard kind, or a star that's been actively changed by something that happened beneath it. This reopens the giant question, but from the opposite direction. In the first theory, the giant's death created the star. In this second theory, the star might have already existed, might have always been red, might be one of the outer god-adjacent phenomena that dot Elden Ring's cosmology the way the Greater Will, the Frenzied Flame, and the Formless Mother do, and the giant was crucified beneath it specifically because of what the star already represented. Not a consequence, a ritual site, a place chosen because the sky above it was already wrong. In a way the ancient giants understood and we, playing centuries later, do not. This is a genuinely important distinction, so let's slow down on it, because the order of causality changes the entire emotional shape of the story. In the first theory, the giant is a victim, and the star is a wound left behind by what was done to him. That's tragic, but it's a closed loop. It happened, it's over, and the star is a scar, static and unchanging, a monument to a single historical act. In this second theory, the star was already there, already red, already whatever it is, before the giant was ever crucified beneath it. Which means the giants themselves, or whoever crucified this particular giant, knew something about that star and made a choice to use it. That's not a tragedy. That's a ritual with intent behind it, carried out by people, or beings, who understood exactly what they were doing and why the location mattered. If the giants themselves carried out the crucifixion, and there's reasonable textual support for that reading given how isolated and territorial giant culture appears to be elsewhere in the game, then we have to ask what would drive giants to punish one of their own this severely, in this specific location beneath this specific star. Giant culture, from what we can piece together through the fire giant boss fight, the Forge of the Giants, and scattered item descriptions, revolves heavily around the primeval flame and its protection. The flame predates the Erd Tree. It predates the Golden Order entirely. Some lore readings suggest the giants were once far more numerous and far more central to the world's power structure before the Erdtree's rise marginalized them into the frozen periphery they occupy by the time the player arrives. If a giant did something to threaten or compromise the primeval flame, betraying it, extinguishing part of it, or worse, offering knowledge of it to an outside party, a punishment carried out beneath a star already associated with blood and cosmic transgression, would carry an enormous amount of symbolic weight within giant culture specifically, even if it means nothing to the human factions who never go far enough north to see it. There's also a colder, more mechanical possibility worth putting on the table, because not every mystery in a From Software game needs a narrative answer. Sometimes the answer is closer to world-building texture than plot. It's entirely possible the Bloodstar exists primarily to reinforce the region's tone, rather than to encode a specific, discoverable narrative event. The Mountaintops of the Giants is tonally one of the bleakest regions in the game, a frozen, half-abandoned landscape littered with the wreckage of a war that ended before recorded history as the player understands it, populated by giant remains, broken siege equipment, and environmental storytelling that emphasizes loss and diminishment far more than active conflict. A red star hanging over a crucified body fits that tone perfectly, whether or not it has a fully worked out causal explanation behind it. From Software's environmental artists are extremely good at creating images that feel meaningful, that feel like they're pointing towards something specific, without necessarily having a single definitive answer locked into the design document. This isn't a cop-out reading. It's worth taking seriously precisely because it explains why the game gives us so little to work with. If there were a quest, an item, an NPC dialogue tree that explained the Bloodstar directly, we wouldn't be making this video. The absence of an answer might not be a puzzle, it might be the point. That said, and this is important, it's atmospheric and it has specific lore meaning are not mutually exclusive. From Software has a long history of designing images that work on both levels simultaneously, tone first, explicit lore second, layered so that the environmental impact lands immediately, and the deeper meaning rewards the players willing to dig. The Bloodstar almost certainly operates the same way. It reads as ominous and wrong the moment you see it, no lore knowledge required, and then it opens up into genuine interpretive depth for anyone willing to cross-reference item descriptions, giant culture, and the broader cosmology of blood as an active force in this world. Both things can be true. The atmosphere is the entry point. The deeper lore is what keeps analysts like us coming back to it years after release. Let's shift now to a theory that a smaller but very dedicated part of the community has pushed hard, because it connects the Bloodstar to one of the strangest and least examined threads in Elden Ring's cosmology. The idea that it might be tied not to the giants at all, but to the Scarlet Rot, and by extension, to the Millennia and Miquella storyline running through Caelid and the Haligtree. At first glance, this connection seems like a stretch, and it's worth acknowledging that up front rather than pretending the case is airtight, because Scarlet Rot is usually associated with the color that's right there in its name, a sickly orange-red bloom rather than the deep saturated crimson of actual blood. But the two are linked more closely in this setting's underlying logic than the color difference suggests. Scarlet Rot is repeatedly described across item text as a corruption that moves through living tissue, through blood, through the body's own systems, turning growth and vitality into decay from the inside out. Millennia herself is described as having scarlet rot in her blood specifically, not as an external affliction, but as something intrinsic to her, something she was born with or infected by so early and so completely that it became inseparable from what she is. Her rot isn't a disease she caught. It's closer to a second parasitic nature grown into her own bloodstream, one she has learned to weaponize rather than simply endure. If scarlet rot is fundamentally a disease of the blood, and if the color scheme is close enough to read as a variant rather than a wholly separate phenomenon, then the theory holds that the Bloodstar could represent rot on a cosmic scale, a corruption vast enough to reach the sky itself, sitting above the frozen north as a kind of warning or a kind of forecast of what happens when blood-borne corruption is left unchecked for long enough. Under this reading, the crucified giant beneath it isn't the cause of the star. He's a casualty of it, someone caught in the path of a corruption spreading from somewhere else entirely, possibly from Caelid, possibly from something even older. And the Bloodstar is less a monument to one specific act of violence and more a marker of contamination that happens to be visible from a great distance, because of just how severe it's become. The problem with this theory, and it's a real problem, is that there's no direct textual link connecting Scarlet Rot specifically to the mountaintops region or to the giant crucifixion. Caelid and the mountaintops of the giants are about as geographically and thematically distant as two regions can be within the lands between, one a fetid, disease-choked lowland, the other a frozen, wind-scoured highland at the literal top of the map. There's no NPC dialogue, no item description, no environmental detail that draws a direct line between the two. This theory relies almost entirely on color association and thematic resonance, rather than concrete evidence, which puts it on shakier ground than the giant-centric readings we covered earlier. It's worth including because it represents a genuine strand of community discussion, and because it highlights something important about how these theories get built in the absence of confirmed answers. Sometimes the connections analysts draw say more about pattern recognition across a game's broader themes than about anything the developers specifically intended for this one object. That's not a criticism of the theory or the people who hold it. It's just an honest acknowledgement of where the evidentiary floor is, and it's worth remembering as we move through the rest of this video, because not every theory we cover is going to rest on equally solid ground. And part of doing this kind of analysis responsibly is being upfront about which ideas are well supported, and which ones are speculative extensions built on thinner textual foundations. Now let's turn to what might be the most compelling theory of all, one that ties together the star, the giant, and the game's central cosmological framework in a way that actually holds up under scrutiny far better than the Scarlet Rot connection does. The idea that the Blood Star is directly connected to the Elden Ring's shattering, and specifically to the death of Godwyn. This is where things get, in my opinion, genuinely disturbing, because if this theory holds, the Bloodstar isn't a regional curiosity confined to one corner of the map. It's a visible symptom of the single most consequential event in the entire game's backstory. Let's establish what we actually know about Godwyn's death, because it's one of the strangest deaths in the entire game. And its strangeness is exactly why it's relevant here. Godwyn was the firstborn son of Queen Marika and Godfrey, considered the golden child of the Erdtree's royal family, destined by most accounts to inherit rule of the lands between. He was murdered by Ranni's death rune-empowered blade, Fell Twin, wielded by Ranni's shadow servant Black Knife assassin Electo, or read by some as a broader Black Knife conspiracy, but the crucial detail isn't who wielded the blade, it's what the blade did. Ordinarily, in a world governed by the Golden Order and the power of the Elden Ring, death is not an end. The dead don't stay dead in any permanent sense. They're bound into an eternal cycle of rebirth, their remains returning to the Erdtree, their souls, or runes, cycling back into the world. This is the entire foundation of the Golden Order's promise, death without disappearance. But Godwyn was killed with an actual instrument of death itself, a fragment of the rune of death that Ranni's ancestor Malekith, the Black Blade, had once wielded and sealed away specifically because true death was considered too dangerous, too final, to allow into general circulation. When that blade struck Godwyn, it didn't just kill his body, it killed him permanently, severing him from the cycle of rebirth that every other death in this setting is subject to. His body died, but importantly, his soul, or some part of what makes Godwyn Godwyn, did not fully depart, because death itself, the mechanism that would normally usher a soul out of the cycle entirely, had been sealed away from the world for so long that even a fragment of it acting on one person produced something the setting had never had to process before. A person who is dead, and also isn't, hovering in an unprecedented in-between state. This is why Godwyn's physical body, or a version of it, ends up rooted beneath the Mogwyn Dynasty mausoleum, in that same blood-soaked lake we discussed earlier, tangled in what the game refers to as the Death Root, a substance that spreads throughout the lands between specifically because of Godwyn's unprecedented death. Deathroot isn't just an item you collect for crafting purposes, although mechanically that's exactly what it functions as. Thematically, it's described as a physical manifestation of Godwyn's lingering, incomplete death spreading through the roots and soil of the entire world, a kind of infection of finality leaking outward from a single point of origin, because the world's systems for processing death broke in a way they were never designed to break. And this is the detail that matters most for our purposes. Multiple item descriptions and environmental details associate this spreading corruption with blood specifically, not with rot, not with decay in the Scarlet Rot sense, but with blood as the medium through which Godwyn's unnatural death propagates outward from the mausoleum. If Godwyn's death created a blood-borne wound in the world's fundamental metaphysics, a wound significant enough to physically manifest as spreading root systems across the entire map. It is not an unreasonable leap, and I want to stress that this leap is considerably shorter than the one required for the Scarlet Rot theory, to suggest that the same wound could manifest in the sky as well as in the ground. The Lands Between doesn't have a hard boundary between what happens below and what happens above. We already established that with the star magic system, the idea that constellations and comets can be summoned down and channeled by sorcerers at the Church of Repose, literally in visual range of the Blood Star itself. If magic and cosmic power can flow downward from the stars into the hands of mortal sorcerers, there's no structural reason the reverse couldn't be true. A sufficiently catastrophic metaphysical wound on the ground reaching upward and staining the sky. Under this theory, the Blood Star isn't specifically about the giant crucified beneath it at all. The giant might be incidental, a body chosen for display precisely because it was already there, already dead, in a location that happened to fall beneath where this cosmic wound was visible. The star is Godwyn. The star is the shattering, made visible, hanging permanently over the mountaintops as a kind of open sky wound that never fully closed, because Godwyn himself, in his half-dead, half-alive state, never fully closed either. This reading gains additional weight when you consider the geography. The mountaintops of the Giants sits at the far northern edge of the map, and it's also where players eventually find the crucified form of Fortisax, the Deathright bird, and further on near the game's in-game areas, the Elden beast and the Erdtree's roots reaching their absolute limit. This is, structurally, the region closest to the metaphysical top of the game's cosmology, the place where the Erdtree's influence and the deeper truths of the setting are most exposed and least mediated by the ordinary rules that govern the rest of the map. If Godwyn's unprecedented, unnatural death was going to leave a visible mark anywhere in the sky, the frozen north, the region already associated with the game's oldest wars, its most exposed metaphysical wounds, and its closest proximity to divine and near-divine beings, is exactly where you'd expect that mark to be most visible. There's a version of this theory that goes even further, associating the Blood Star not just generally with Godwyn's death, but specifically with the moment his blood was scattered by the Rune of Death, suggesting the star is a literal cosmic reflection, almost a photograph burned into the sky, of that exact instant, the same way a flashbulb leaves an afterimage on your vision. This is more speculative and harder to substantiate directly, but it's consistent with how the setting treats major metaphysical events elsewhere. The Erdtree itself changed color, from gold to a sickly ashen white, following the shattering, a visible, permanent world-scale symptom of a metaphysical catastrophe. If the Erdtree's own color can shift in direct response to what happened to the Elden Ring after Marika shattered it, there's real precedent within the game's own visual language for a similarly permanent, similarly visible mark appearing elsewhere in the world's most sacred and cosmologically significant imagery in response to Godwyn's death specifically, which, worth remembering, happened around the same general period as the broader shattering itself, and is deeply entangled with why the shattering happened at all. Now, does this theory fully explain the crucified giant? Not entirely, and it's worth being honest about that gap rather than smoothing over it. If the star is fundamentally about Godwyn, the giant's specific crucifixion still needs its own explanation, layered on top of, rather than replacing, whatever the star itself represents. The two most likely readings, if you accept the Godwyn connection as your foundation, are either that the giant was crucified there specifically because the location was already understood, by whoever carried out the punishment, to carry cosmic significance thanks to the star, making the star older and the crucifixion a later addition that deliberately chose this site for its symbolic weight, or that the giant's crucifixion and the star's appearance are entirely unconnected events that simply happen to share the same physical space, two separate tragedies stacked on top of each other by coincidence rather than design. Neither of these fully closes the loop, and I think that's honestly the most accurate place to leave it. The Godwyn theory explains the star convincingly. It does not, on its own, explain the giant, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise just to hand you a tidier conclusion. Before we move further into some of the stranger corners of this theory space, if you're finding this kind of deep dive lore breakdown useful, dropping a subscribe helps this channel keep making them, and I've got a lot more of the Lands Between left to cover. Let's talk now about the giants themselves, because up to this point we've mostly treated the crucified giant as a passive element in the story, a body positioned beneath the star rather than an active participant with his own history. But Elden Ring gives us more material on giant culture than most players realize. scattered across item descriptions, environmental storytelling in the mountaintops and the consecrated snowfield, and the boss encounters with the fire giant himself. And that material paints a picture of a once great civilization in active, ongoing decline, which changes how we should read the crucifixion. The fire giants, as we're shown them in the present-day lands between, are down to a startlingly small number. The fire giant boss fight is framed, through both the environmental setup and the item descriptions surrounding it, as potentially the final defender of the primeval flame, an old and enormous being clinging to a duty that used to be shared among many and is now his alone. Scattered giant remains litter the region, some clearly dead for a very long time, others more recent, and the overall impression is of a people who were once far more numerous, far more central to the world's power structure, and have been reduced, over an unspecified but clearly vast span of time, to a scattered handful clinging to the coldest, most marginal corner of the map. This matters because it reframes the crucifixion. A crucifixion within a thriving populous culture is one kind of punishment, a public statement made to a large audience with the expectation that the lesson will be absorbed and remembered by many. A crucifixion within a dying culture, one down to its last handful of members, is something else entirely. It's not a lesson for the community. There might not be enough of a community left for it to function as one. It starts to look more like a private reckoning, or worse, a sacrifice made by people who felt they had no other options left. That word, sacrifice, deserves real attention here, because it opens up a version of this theory that a significant portion of the analytical community has gravitated toward. And it's worth taking seriously rather than treating it as just another equally weighted possibility, because the evidence for it is stronger than for several of the theories we've already covered. What if the crucifixion wasn't punishment at all? What if it was a desperate ritual, carried out by a dying people trying to protect or preserve something, using the only resource they had left, one of their own? We know, from the primeval flame lore surrounding the Forge of the Giants, that the Giants' entire cultural identity is bound up in guarding something ancient, something that predates the Erd Tree, something they consider sacred enough to have organized their whole society around protecting it for what the game strongly implies is an almost unfathomably long span of time. If that flame were ever under threat, whether from an external force we're never shown directly, or from something more abstract like the general metaphysical decay that seems to be spreading throughout the lands between, in the build-up to and aftermath of the shattering, a dwindling people with dwindling options might turn to increasingly desperate measures to protect it. A blood sacrifice, offered beneath a star already associated, in giant tradition or giant cosmology we're never given full access to, with power, protection, or some binding function, would fit within the broader pattern From Software uses across all of its games. Societies in decline turning to increasingly extreme and often self-destructive rituals as their options narrow in their desperation. Grows. We see versions of this same pattern in the Carrion royal family's slow descent into magical extremism, in the Volcano Manor's increasingly compromised methods of maintaining relevance, in the Omen's brutal treatment by the Erd Tree faith. Elden Ring is, structurally, a game about declining institutions doing worse and worse things to survive, and a desperate blood ritual carried out by the last handful of giants fits that pattern precisely. Under this reading, the blood star isn't a mark left by what happened to the giant. It's closer to a target, a marker of significance the giants were reaching toward, attempting to draw on, or attempting to appease, using the crucifixion as an offering. This flips the causality entirely from the very first theory we covered. The star didn't respond to the blood. The blood was offered up to the star, because the star already meant something tied to protection, to power, or to whatever primal force the giants have spent their entire existence as a species trying to keep in balance. This raises an obvious and uncomfortable follow-up question. If it was a sacrifice, did it work? The game gives us no clean answer, but the environmental evidence leans pessimistic. The primeval flame is still there when the player arrives, still burning, still guarded, but the giants themselves are all but gone. If the crucifixion was meant to save something, it seems, at best, to have only partially succeeded, buying time rather than securing a lasting victory, or possibly failing outright while the flame's survival owes itself to other factors entirely, unconnected to the sacrifice at all. There's also a bleaker possibility worth naming directly rather than dancing around. That the ritual worked exactly as intended, and its cost was the giants themselves. Some sacrifices in mythology and in From Software's own prior games aren't meant to be repeatable. They're meant to be final, one enormous expenditure in exchange for one enormous outcome, with nothing left over afterward to sustain the people who paid the price. If that's what happened here, the crucified giant beneath the blood star isn't a failed ritual or a partial success. He's the reason the giants survived as long as they did, and the star hanging above him is the last visible proof that the payment was made. Let's step back now and talk about something we've touched on but haven't fully unpacked, the outer gods, and where the blood star might fit within that framework specifically. Because if there's a category of explanation that From Software has used consistently across their catalog for exactly this kind of unexplained cosmic phenomenon, it's this one. Elden Ring's cosmology is established primarily through Ennia's dialogue at the Round Table Hold and scattered item descriptions throughout the game, includes a category of beings referred to as outer gods, or the greater will in its rival or parallel entities, forces that exist largely outside the normal metaphysical structure the Golden Order imposes on the lands between. The greater will is the outer god responsible for the Erd Tree and the Golden Order itself, having sent the Elden Ring down to the lands between and installed Mareka as its vessel. But the greater will is explicitly not alone. The frenzied flame is associated with another outer god entirely, one whose goal seems to be the complete unmaking of all order and all life. The formless mother, tied to Moog and the Bloodlord's storyline, may represent yet another. Miquella's abandonment of the Erd Tree in pursuit of his own godhood implies the possibility of essentially manufacturing new divine influence where none currently exists, suggesting that outer gods aren't necessarily fixed, ancient, unchangeable forces, but something closer to cosmic vacancies waiting for a claimant, or forces that can be cultivated, invited, or grown into existence by sufficiently determined and sufficiently power-armed mortals. If outer gods can be numerous, can be partially hidden, and can express their influence through specific colors, specific substances, and specific regions of effect. The way the frenzied flame expresses through fire and madness and the formless mother expresses through blood and flesh, then a red star, sitting apart from every other star in a sky otherwise governed by whatever cosmological system the greater will's astrology sorceries draw from, is a very plausible candidate for exactly this kind of outer god signature. Not a symbol of one event, not a scar left by one death, a permanent window or wound or eye through which some blood-associated outer god, whether that's the formless mother specifically or some other force we've never been given a name for, watches the lands between or exerts influence on it from outside the world's normal metaphysical boundaries entirely. This reading has the advantage of explaining why the star is permanent and singular in a way the other theories struggle with. A memorial to a giant's death should, logically, fade or at least remain static rather than actively pulsing with the kind of dull, living light the game's visual design gives it. A wound from Godwin's death, while compelling, still requires us to explain why it manifests specifically as a star rather than through some other visual language, given that Godwin's other symptoms throughout the game, the death root, the divine tower of West Altus's proximity to his remains, tend to manifest as ground-level, physical, biological corruption rather than as celestial phenomena. And outer god's ongoing presence, however, would naturally read as permanent, unchanging, and slightly alive-looking, because outer gods in this cosmology are not historical events. They're active, ongoing entities with continuous influence on the world. The same way the Greater Will's continued backing is what keeps the Golden Order's fundamental rules of death and rebirth functioning at all, even centuries after Mareka's initial contact with it. Under this framework, the crucified giant beneath the star isn't the cause of the star, and isn't necessarily a sacrifice made to appease it either, though that reading remains compatible. He might simply be a casualty, someone or something caught too close to an outer god's zone of influence and transformed, punished, or destroyed by proximity alone, the same way characters throughout From Software's catalog are repeatedly shown to be irreversibly changed, physically and mentally, by prolonged exposure to cosmic forces they were never equipped to withstand. Khasa's child in Bloodborne. The various frenzied flame-touched NPCs scattered throughout Elden Ring, driven to madness and self-immolation by contact with a force whose true scale they were never able to comprehend. If the outer god reading is correct, the giant might not have any special significance to the star at all. He might simply be where the light happened to fall. There's a specific detail worth raising here, one that a smaller portion of the community has pointed to as supporting evidence for the outer god theory over the more historically grounded readings we covered earlier, The star's color doesn't map cleanly onto any single established blood source in the game. It's not the specific rust orange of the Mulgwyn dynasty's Blood Lake. It's not the sickly crimson into black of Scarlet Rot's more advanced stages. It reads, in most lighting conditions in-game, as a cleaner, almost luminous red, closer to what you'd get from freshly spilled blood than from blood that's been aged, corrupted, or ritually altered in any of the specific ways the game's other blood-associated locations display. If the color is meant to be read literally rather than symbolically, that specificity might matter. It could suggest a blood source that's neither the giant's own, nor Godwyn's decayed and root-tangled remains, nor Mohg's ritually darkened lake, but something else. Something whose blood hasn't been given a clear on-screen source anywhere else in the game. Which would push the theory decisively toward an entity we simply haven't been introduced to directly, an outer god whose only confirmed appearance in the entire game is this single, unexplained star. I want to be careful here not to overstate the confidence of this reading, because color perception in a game with dynamic lighting, weather, and time of day systems is genuinely difficult to pin down with the kind of precision this argument requires, and different players report seeing subtly different shades depending on their display settings, their proximity, and even the specific version of the game they're running. But the underlying logic, that the outer god framework fits the permanence and singularity of the phenomenon better than any historically anchored explanation, holds up regardless of exactly which shade of red we're arguing about, and I think it deserves serious weight alongside the giant sacrifice and Godwyn theories, rather than being treated as the fringe reading. If anything, of the theories we've covered so far, this might be the one with the fewest logical gaps, precisely because it doesn't require us to fully explain the giant. It only requires us to accept that the giant was standing, or was placed, somewhere significant, which the environmental staging already tells us regardless of which theory you ultimately favor. Let's pause the theorizing for a moment and do something more grounded, because I think it's worth walking through the actual textual evidence piece by piece. The specific item descriptions and environmental details that any of these theories has to answer to, rather than just stacking interpretation on top of interpretation without ever checking back against the source material itself. The most direct textual anchor we have isn't a description of the star itself, because notably, and this is worth sitting with, the game never gives us an item, a memory, or a piece of dialogue that explicitly names or explains the blood star. That absence is itself significant. From Software is a studio that when it wants a piece of environmental storytelling explained, usually gives you the tools to explain it. An item description here, an NPC comment there, something that rewards attentive players with confirmation. The complete silence around a blood star, given how visually prominent it is, suggests either that its meaning was intended to remain genuinely ambiguous, consistent with the broader atmosphere over explanation reading we discussed earlier, or that its explanation exists somewhere we haven't found yet, in cut content, in a DLC expansion, or in material that simply didn't make it into the base game's final text. Both possibilities are worth holding in mind as we go through what we do have. What we do have is the crucified giant's positioning relative to the Church of Repose. And the Church of Repose's own item descriptions are worth examining closely, because this is the strongest concrete textual anchor point in the entire region. The Church of Repose is associated with a cluster of gravity and rune-based sorceries, taught there because the location itself is described as connected to the study of runes and the nature of death within the Golden Order's system. This is not incidental. A location dedicated to studying death, runes, and the mechanics of rebirth, positioned in direct sightline of both a crucified giant and a star that many theories connect to blood, death, or cosmic corruption, is not a coincidental layout. From Software's level design teams build regions with thematic coherence as a first principle, clustering related concepts geographically, so that the environment itself teaches you what to think about before you've read a single word of text. The Church of Repose isn't teaching gravity magic in isolation. It's teaching gravity and rune magic in a location saturated with death imagery, which strongly implies the developers wanted players to associate the study of death and rebirth mechanics with exactly the imagery we've been discussing throughout this video. There's also the broader pattern of how Fire Giant adjacent equipment describes the giant's relationship to death and to the primeval flame. And while none of these descriptions name the blood star directly, several of them describe the Fire Giant's rule as guardians whose duty is bound up with concepts of eternal vigilance and eternal cost, phrasing that leans toward the sacrifice reading we discussed a few chapters back without ever fully confirming it. This is frustrating from a purely evidentiary standpoint, because it means every theory we've covered, the symbolic consequence reading, the pre-existing cosmic phenomenon reading, the Godwin connection, the sacrifice ritual, the outer god's signature, all of them are compatible with the available text, and none of them are confirmed by it. From Software has left us a puzzle with several equally plausible solutions and no answer key, which, again, might be less a failure of the writing than a deliberate design choice, consistent with how this studio has always treated its most cosmic and unsettling imagery. That consistency is worth exploring directly, because the Bloodstar doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within a design language From Software has been building and refining since Demon's Souls. And looking at how this studio has handled similarly unexplained celestial or cosmic imagery in its prior titles gives us useful comparative context for how to read the Bloodstar specifically. Dark Souls gives us the moon that hangs, unusually large and unusually present, above certain regions, most notably associated with the Duke's archives in Seath the Scaleless, an area thick with crystal, moonlight sorcery, and implications of something ancient and half-understood pressing against the edges of the world's more grounded, fire and flame-centered cosmology. Notably, that moon is also never fully explained. We're given fragments, Seath's obsession with the primordial crystal, his search for something he calls true immortality, his association with the moon-adjacent crystalline magic. But the moon itself, as an object, remains exactly as unexplained as the Bloodstar does. Bloodborne gives us an even more direct parallel, the transformation of Yharnam's sky during the game's later stages, when the moon presence's influence becomes overt and the entire visual palette of the world shifts to something dreamlike, blood-red tinged and cosmically wrong, is one of the most celebrated pieces of environmental storytelling From Software has ever produced, and it too is conveyed almost entirely without direct textual explanation. Players understand what's happening because of tone, color, and pacing, not because an item description spells it out for them. The Bloodstar fits comfortably into this exact tradition. It's not an outlier in From Software's design philosophy. It's a continuation of a technique this studio has used, refined, and clearly considers effective across at least 3 major titles. Give players an image potent enough to feel meaningful, and trust them to sit with the ambiguity rather than resolve it for them. This pattern matters because it should recalibrate our expectations going into the rest of this video. We are very likely not going to land on a single, confirmed, textually airtight answer for what the Bloodstar is, because From Software's entire design philosophy for this specific category of imagery is built around resisting exactly that kind of closure. What we can do, and what the rest of this video is going to focus on, is narrow the field, weigh the theories against each other with the evidence we actually have, and be honest about which readings are strongest, which are weakest, and which parts of the mystery are likely to remain permanently, deliberately open. Let's bring in a connection that doesn't get discussed as often as the Godwin theory but deserves serious consideration, because it involves a region sitting almost directly adjacent to the Bloodstar's visible range, the consecrated snowfield, and the frozen, sealed-away tragedy of Maquella's Haligtree. The consecrated snowfield is one of the strangest regions in the entire game, a hidden, snow-buried area accessible only through a specific and easily missed method, containing the remnants of a war fought against something the game refers to obliquely through item descriptions tied to the Golden Order fundamentalists, and the ashen remains of what appears to have been a massive, failed military campaign. This region sits directly to the west of the mountaintops of the Giants, close enough that the two areas share weather patterns, share the same frozen, wind-scoured tone, and are clearly meant to be understood as thematically and geographically connected pieces of the same broader frozen north. If the Bloodstar is visible from the mountaintops, it's reasonable to assume it's light. Or its influence extends into the snowfield as well, which means whatever caused the war fought there could plausibly be entangled with whatever the Bloodstar represents. The consecrated snowfield's central tragedy revolves around Maquella's Haligtree, sealed away and protected specifically because Maquella, in his pursuit of a compassion so absolute it curdles into something closer to control, was pursuing a form of godhood that required sealing away and protecting an enormous, vulnerable project from outside interference. The Golden Order fundamentalists, a splinter faction convinced that the true Golden Order requires wiping out anyone touched by the frenzied flame or by any form of impurity, waged what the item descriptions describe as a catastrophic, failed war against the Haligtree's defenses, ending in their total destruction, Their remains scattered and frozen across the snowfield in a tableau nearly as bleak as the crucified giant we've spent this entire video discussing. Both the giant and the fundamentalist army are examples of the same underlying pattern, a faction attempting something ambitious, provoking a response, and being annihilated for it. Their remains left as a permanent, visible warning within the frozen landscape. If the Bloodstar's influence extends across this broader northern region rather than being narrowly localized to the giant specifically, it's worth asking whether the star had any bearing on the fundamentalists' catastrophic defeat, or whether Miquella's pursuit of his own godhood. Itself deeply entangled with the Scarlet Rot given his eventual co-option of Millennia's condition and his broader manipulation of blood and rot-adjacent power as tools toward transcendence, might connect back to the earlier Scarlet Rot theory in a way that gives it more textual weight than it had on its own. Miquella is, after all, one of the only figures in the entire game actively attempting to cultivate influence resembling an outer god's, per the theory we discussed a few chapters ago, which means if the Bloodstar is an outer god's signature, Miquella's presence in the immediately adjacent region, sealed away and actively working toward exactly that kind of cosmic ascension, is a genuinely suspicious coincidence rather than an incidental one. I want to be honest about the limits of this connection too, the same way I was with the Scarlet Rot theory earlier. The Consecrated Snowfield's tragedy is very likely narratively self-contained, a story about the Golden Order fundamentalist zealotry and Miquella's isolation that doesn't strictly need the Bloodstar to make sense on its own terms, and the geographic proximity, while suggestive, isn't the same as confirmed textual overlap. But I think it's worth including here because it illustrates something important about how these theories interact with each other rather than existing in isolation. The Godwin theory, the Outer God theory, and this Miquella adjacent reading aren't necessarily competing explanations that cancel each other out. They might be describing the same underlying phenomenon, a broader metaphysical instability radiating outward from multiple compounding sources across the lands between's history, from multiple points of origin, converging visually in this one unexplained object hanging over the mountaintops. That idea that the Bloodstar might not have a single origin at all, but could be a kind of convergence point where several of the setting's separate tragedies bleed into and reinforce each other, both literally and figuratively, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it might be the most honest synthesis of everything we've covered so far. From Software's world design rarely isolates its major metaphysical events from each other cleanly. The Shattering, Godwin's death, Miquella's abandonment of the Erd Tree, the Giant's long decline, and the general spread of instability throughout the lands between all happen within roughly the same broad historical window, entangled with each other through the shared connective tissue of characters like Ranni, Radagon, and Marika, whose actions ripple outward and touch nearly every other major storyline in the game to some degree. If the Bloodstar is, in some sense, a symptom of the world's overall metaphysical health, rather than a marker tied to one single cause, it wouldn't be inconsistent with anything we've established. It would simply mean the mystery was never designed to have one clean, singular answer in the first place, and every theory we've walked through captures a piece of a larger, deliberately unresolved truth rather than being right or wrong in isolation. Now, I know some of you are going to push back on that framing, and I want to address the strongest counter-argument directly rather than just gesturing past it, because it deserves a real response. The counter-argument goes like this. Treating every theory as partially true is intellectually convenient but analytically weak, because it lets us avoid actually weighing the evidence and picking the strongest reading. And a video that ends by saying maybe they're all true a little bit hasn't actually done the interpretive work it promised at the outset. That's a fair criticism, and I don't want to hide from it. So let's actually do that work. Let's rank these theories against each other honestly, based on the strength of the textual evidence supporting each one, rather than treating them as equally weighted possibilities just because none of them can be fully disproven. Ranking the theories from weakest evidentiary footing to strongest, and I want to stress that weakest here doesn't mean wrong. It means least directly supported by confirmed in-game text, which is a different and more honest standard than simply asking which idea sounds coolest. At the bottom sits the direct Scarlet Rot connection, the theory that the Bloodstar represents rot on a cosmic scale. We covered why. The color association is suggestive but imprecise. There's no direct geographic or narrative bridge between Caelid and the mountaintops, and the theory relies almost entirely on thematic resonance rather than anything textual. It's not a bad theory. It reflects real pattern recognition about how this game treats corrupted blood and bodily decay as intertwined concepts. But on its own, Without the Maquella adjacent framing we discussed to strengthen it, it's the shakiest of everything we've covered. Above that sits the pure atmosphere reading, the idea that the Bloodstar exists primarily for tonal reinforcement without a specific, discoverable causal explanation behind it. I'm ranking this low not because I think it's unlikely. Honestly, it might be closer to the truth than several of the more elaborate theories, but because it's almost unfalsifiable. And a theory that can't be meaningfully tested against the evidence, even if it happens to be correct, doesn't do much analytical work for us. It's a useful reminder to hold in the background rather than a theory we can rank against the others on its own terms. Next comes the consecrated Snowfield and Maquella connection. Real geographic proximity, real thematic resonance around cosmic ascension and blood-adjacent power, but ultimately circumstantial, resting on adjacency rather than confirmed textual overlap. It's a genuinely useful lens for thinking about how the Bloodstar might relate to the broader northern region's tragedies, but it doesn't stand strongly enough on its own to rank near the top. Then we have the giant sacrifice theory, and this is where the evidence starts getting considerably stronger. The giants' well-documented decline, their culturally central duty of guarding the primeval flame, the pattern of desperate, self-destructive rituals From Software uses consistently across declining factions throughout this game and its predecessors, and the crucifixion-specific staging, deliberate, prominent, clearly meant to be seen. All of this adds up to a theory with real textual grounding even without a single item description confirming it outright. This is a theory built from consistent inference across multiple confirmed data points rather than from a single thread of thematic resonance, which puts it on considerably firmer ground than anything we've covered so far. Just above that, and genuinely difficult to rank against the giant sacrifice theory because I think the two are more compatible than competing, sits the Outer God's signature theory, the permanence and singularity of the star, its resistance to fitting cleanly into any of the game's already established blood sources, and the broader precedent From Software has set across Dark Souls and Bloodborne for exactly this kind of unexplained cosmic imagery, all support this reading strongly. Its main weakness is that it explains the star extremely well while explaining the giant only loosely, requiring the sacrifice theory or something like it to fill that gap. And at the top, in my assessment, the strongest single theory when measured purely against confirmed textual weight is the Godwin connection. Godwin's death is the single most well-documented metaphysical catastrophe in the entire game's backstory. Its blood-associated spread through Deathroot is explicitly confirmed rather than inferred. Its timeline plausibly overlaps with whatever caused the Bloodstar, and the broader precedent of the Erd Tree itself visibly changing color in response to the shattering gives us a confirmed in-game example of exactly the kind of ground-to-sky metaphysical transmission this theory requires. It still has the same weakness we identified earlier, that it explains the star far better than it explains the specific choice of the crucified giant. But of every theory we've walked through, it rests on the largest number of independently confirmed textual pillars, rather than relying primarily on inference or thematic pattern matching. So if you're asking me to give you my honest, ranked assessment rather than a diplomatic everyone's theory is valid non-answer, the Bloodstar is most likely a visible symptom of Godwin's unprecedented, unnatural death, functioning similarly to an outer god-adjacent wound in the world's cosmology, and the giant crucified beneath it was very likely placed there deliberately by the giants themselves, in a desperate ritual attempting to draw on or appease whatever cosmic significance that location and that star already carried, tied to their broader, centuries-long struggle to protect the primeval flame as their numbers dwindled toward the handful we find remaining by the time the player arrives. That's a synthesis of the top two theories rather than a single, cleanly isolated answer, and I think that's the most intellectually honest place to land, because the evidence genuinely points toward both being true simultaneously, rather than one having to be selected at the expense of the other. But I want to be clear that this is an interpretation, not a confirmed fact. And I'd encourage you to weigh the evidence yourself rather than taking my ranking as the final word. This is exactly the kind of ambiguity From Software writes into its games on purpose, and part of what makes this community's lore analysis genuinely fun, rather than just an exercise in trivia recall, is that reasonable, careful readers of the same text can land in meaningfully different places. Let's talk for a moment about how this theory space actually developed within the community, because the Bloodstar's discourse has an interesting history that's worth understanding if you want the full picture of where these ideas came from and how they've shifted over time. In the immediate weeks after Elden Ring's launch, the Bloodstar barely registered as a topic of discussion at all. Players were, understandably, overwhelmed by an enormous open world packed with hundreds of items, dozens of major NPC storylines, and a genuinely dense central cosmology involving the Golden Order, the Outer Gods, and the fractured royal family. And a single decorative object in the sky, however striking, competed for attention against an avalanche of more immediately pressing mysteries. It took several months, well into the game's first year, before dedicated lore channels and forum threads started specifically isolating the Bloodstar as its own subject worth independent analysis, rather than treating it as a minor detail folded into broader mountaintops of the Giants discussion. The earliest documented theories tended to lean heavily toward the simplest reading, the symbolic consequence theory we opened this video with, treating the star as a straightforward, if poetic, marker of the Giants' death without much further elaboration. It was only as the community's collective understanding of Godwin's death and its deathroot mechanics deepened, helped considerably by data mining efforts that uncovered additional item descriptions and cut content, revealing more about the Rune of Death's mechanics than the base game's main path alone makes clear, that the more sophisticated Godwin-connected reading started gaining real traction. This is worth noting because it illustrates something important about how lore analysis in this community actually works over time. It's rarely a single moment of discovery. It's an accumulating process, where earlier, simpler theories get revisited, refined, and sometimes significantly revised as more information becomes available, whether through data mining, through careful cross-referencing of item descriptions that initially seemed unrelated, or simply through the community having more time to sit with the material and notice connections that weren't obvious on a first or even a 10th playthrough. The Outer God theory we discussed a few chapters back emerged somewhat later and somewhat more gradually, growing out of broader community discussion about the frenzied flame, the formless mother, and the increasingly apparent pattern of multiple competing outer gods, rather than just the single greater will most players assume governs the setting on a first playthrough. This theory's development says something interesting about how our collective understanding of Elden Ring's cosmology has matured since launch. Early discourse tended to treat the greater will as effectively synonymous with the divine in this setting, full stop, with the frenzied flame positioned as its sole opposing force. It took considerable community effort, cross-referencing dozens of scattered item descriptions across multiple regions, to build out the fuller picture of a cosmology with several distinct outer gods, each with their own domain, their own associated substance or symbol, and their own agenda, only some of which the base game ever brings into direct focus. The Bloodstar fits naturally into that more mature understanding in a way it simply couldn't have when the community's grasp of the Outer God framework was still comparatively thin. If you've enjoyed this deep dive so far, this is exactly the kind of granular, easy-to-miss detail this channel exists to dig into, so if you haven't already, a subscribe genuinely helps more of these get made. Now let's talk about Shadow of the Erd Tree, because the Dilk's release gave the community an enormous amount of new material to work with. And while it doesn't address the Bloodstar directly, in the sense that there's still no explicit item description or NPC line that names it, several of its major story beats bear directly enough on the theories we've covered that they're worth folding into our analysis rather than treating this video as frozen at base game release. The most significant addition for our purposes is the Land of Shadow's deep excavation of Mareka's backstory and her origins as Radagon prior to becoming the vessel of the Elden Ring, along with the much fuller picture we're given of Messmer, the Impaler, and his own campaign of fire and serpent-based conquest across the Shadow Realm. Messmer's storyline is worth dwelling on specifically because it reintroduces crucifixion as recurring imagery in an even more overt and widespread form than the single giant we've spent this video discussing. The Shadowkeep and surrounding areas are, quite literally, saturated with impaled and crucified figures, victims of Messmer's brutal suppression of the Shadowlands' native population, and the sheer scale of that imagery retroactively changes how we should read the single crucified giant back in the base game's mountaintops. If crucifixion, on this scale, is established as a recurring tool wielded specifically by figures connected to Mareka's bloodline and to the earliest, least Golden Order compliant periods of the setting's history, it strengthens the reading that the giant's crucifixion wasn't a giant-on-giant ritual at all, but something inflicted on the giants from outside, potentially by an even earlier iteration of the same Erd Tree adjacent power structure that Messmer represents in the Shadow Realm. This matters considerably for how we weigh the sacrifice theory against the Outer God and Godwin theories. If crucifixion in this setting's broader visual language is primarily associated with punishment inflicted by Golden Order adjacent power onto those who resist or fall outside it, rather than with desperate, self-directed ritual sacrifice carried out by a dying people trying to save themselves, the giant crucified beneath the blood star starts to look less like the giant's own doing and more like something done to them, consistent with the broader pattern of the Erdtree's rise coming at direct, violent cost to the older powers, giants included, that existed in the lands between before it. The Dilk also gives us considerably more material on Maquella's manipulation and control of those around him, including extensive new detail on how his particular brand of compassion functions as a form of domination, charming and reshaping the will of everyone from Moog to Radon to Saint. Trina in service of his singular goal of ascending to godhood free from what he perceives as the corrupting influence of madness. This adds real weight to the consecrated Snowfield connection we raised earlier, because it confirms, far more explicitly than the base game ever did, just how far-reaching and how manipulative Maquella's ambitions actually are, making the idea that his presence and his pursuit of outer god-adjacent power could have bled outward into the neighboring mountaintops region considerably more plausible than it was when we only had the base game's comparatively sparse consecrated Snowfield material to work from. None of this gives us a confirmed answer. I want to be very clear about that, because it would be easy, in the excitement of new Dilk material, to overstate how directly connected any of this actually is to the specific object we've spent this entire video examining. But the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion does meaningfully shift the balance of probability across the theories we've covered, strengthening the case that the giant's crucifixion was inflicted rather than self-chosen, while leaving the fundamental mystery of the star itself exactly as unresolved as it was at base game launch. From Software, even with an entire expansion's worth of new lore to work with, chose not to close this particular loop, which I think tells us something important. This is very likely a mystery that was never meant to be solved within the confines of the games themselves, Dilk included, but rather one designed to live permanently in exactly the kind of community discussion, theorizing, and re-examination we've been doing throughout this video. Let's spend some time now on a handful of smaller, more fringe theories that don't have the evidentiary weight to anchor an entire chapter on their own, but that deserve mention because they represent genuine strands of community thought, and because sometimes the smaller, stranger theories end up capturing details the more dominant readings miss entirely. One minority theory holds that the Blood Star isn't connected to any of the major named entities we've discussed at all, but is instead tied to an entirely unnamed, unconfirmed outer god specific to the giant's own, largely unexplored cosmology. This theory notes, correctly, that the giants are one of the least explained factions in the entire game relative to how visually and thematically significant they are, and that we're never given any direct insight into what, if anything, the giants themselves worshipped or believed in beyond their guardianship of the primeval flame. If the giants had their own distinct religious or cosmological framework, one entirely separate from the Golden Order, from the Greater Will, and from every other outer god we've discussed, the Bloodstar could represent something specific to that framework, a giant god, essentially, whose existence the game never confirms, because the giants themselves are so marginalized by the time the player arrives that whatever they once believed has been reduced to fragments too scattered to reconstruct. This theory is difficult to substantiate precisely because it argues for something the game gives us almost no material to work with. But I include it because it's a useful reminder that not every mystery in this setting needs to connect back to the handful of already named cosmic forces we spend most of our analytical energy discussing. Sometimes the answer really might be something the game simply never got around to fully explaining, lost to the same erosion of history that claimed most of giant culture by the time we ever set foot in the mountaintops. Another minority reading, and this one I find genuinely interesting, even though I don't think it holds up as well as the theories we ranked higher earlier, suggests the Bloodstar might be connected to Radon specifically, rather than to Godwyn, Maquella, or the Giants at all. The reasoning here traces back to Radon's status as a demigod whose battle against the stars themselves is referenced obliquely in his own boss arena and surrounding lore, an arena littered with what appeared to be fallen meteors and craters suggesting Radon, at some point in his history, engaged in conflict on a scale that involved the heavens directly rather than purely earthbound warfare. If Radon fought something connected to the stars, and lost some portion of that fight, or won at significant cost, the Bloodstar could theoretically be residue from that conflict, rather than from anything connected to Godwin, the Giants, or Miquella's ambitions. The main weakness here is geographic. Radon's associated imagery is centered in Caelid and the Redmane Castle region, nowhere near the mountaintops of the Giants, and the connection requires assuming his battle against the stars had effects visible from an entirely different, distant region of the map, which is a considerably longer geographic leap than anything the stronger theories require. I don't think this reading ultimately survives close scrutiny, but it's a reminder that Elden Ring's cosmology is dense enough, and its named cosmic conflicts numerous enough, that multiple mutually exclusive theories can each find some thread of textual support if you're willing to stretch far enough to find it. A third and final minor theory worth mentioning treats the Blood Star as connected not to any specific character or faction at all, but to the general phenomenon of the Erdtree's roots and their relationship to death across the entire map, essentially a more diffuse, less character-specific version of the Godwin theory. Under this reading, Deathroot spreading throughout the lands between isn't uniquely and specifically Godwin's, but is instead a broader symptom of the Erdtree's own compromised relationship with death following the Shattering, with Godwin's death being the most significant single contributing event rather than the sole cause. This is a subtler distinction than it might initially sound, because it shifts the Bloodstar's ultimate cause from a single tragic individual to a systemic failure within the Golden Order itself, which changes the emotional register of the entire mystery from this happened to one person, and it was catastrophic enough to stain the sky to the entire system governing life and death in this world. Is broken, and the Bloodstar is one of several visible symptoms of that broader collapse, rather than a monument to any single event. I find this version of the theory genuinely compelling, and it's close enough to our top-ranked reading from earlier that I'd consider it a refinement of the Godwin theory rather than a fully separate competing idea. One that softens the requirement that this specific location, above this specific giant, needed to be causally connected to Godwin's death directly, and instead treats the star as one node within a much larger, distributed pattern of metaphysical decay, stemming from the Golden Order's fundamental brokenness following the Shattering. Let's turn our attention more specifically to the giant himself, because we've spent a lot of this video treating him somewhat abstractly, the crucified giant, without asking a question that deserves real focus. Do we have any indication of who specifically this giant was as an individual, rather than as a generic representative of his species? The honest answer is that the game gives us almost nothing to individuate him. Unlike named NPCs, unlike even some of the more prominent unnamed corpses scattered throughout the lands between, that at least receive some contextualizing detail through nearby item descriptions or environmental staging, the crucified giant is presented to us essentially as an icon rather than an individual. A representative body rather than a specific character with his own confirmed history. This is worth dwelling on because it's a meaningful authorial choice. From Software could have given this figure a name, an item tied specifically to him, some scrap of individuating detail the way they do for countless other corpses and skeletons scattered throughout their games. The decision not to do so suggests his individual identity was never meant to be the point. He's meant to function as a type, a stand-in for a giant crucified beneath this star, rather than as a specific character whose personal story we're meant to piece together. That said, there is one detail worth raising, because it's easy to overlook and it does carry some interpretive weight. The specific pose and positioning of the body, arms outstretched, chained in a manner that deliberately and unmistakably evokes crucifixion as a broader cultural and religious concept, is itself doing symbolic work independent of anything specific to giant culture. Crucifixion, as an image, carries an enormous weight of external, real-world religious and cultural association, evoking sacrifice, atonement, suffering endured on behalf of others, and, depending on the tradition you're drawing from, resurrection or transcendence following that suffering. From Software is a Japanese studio working with a largely Japanese creative team, but their games consistently draw on a wide range of global religious and mythological iconography, and the deliberate use of crucifixion imagery specifically, rather than some other method of execution or display that wouldn't carry the same instantly recognizable cultural weight, is very likely an intentional choice meant to import all of that external symbolic freight directly into how we read this scene. If we take that seriously, it pushes interpretation subtly but meaningfully toward the sacrifice reading over the punishment reading, because crucifixion as a cultural symbol carries stronger connotations of meaningful, purposeful suffering, suffering endured for the sake of something larger than the individual than it does of simple punitive execution, which real-world history and religious tradition tend to code through different imagery entirely. This is, admittedly, an argument built more on symbolic and cultural resonance than on anything textually confirmed within the game itself, and I want to flag that distinction clearly rather than blur it. But I think it's a legitimate lens to apply given how carefully From Software typically chooses its most iconic, most visually loaded imagery. A crucifixion pose chosen deliberately over simpler alternatives is very likely meant to evoke sacrifice specifically, which lends additional support to the ritual reading over the pure punishment framing we discussed earlier in this video, even without a single line of confirming text. There's also a smaller, more mechanically grounded detail worth including here for completeness, because some players have pointed to the specific way the game handles player interaction, or rather the lack of it, with both the giant's corpse and the blood star itself, as evidence for how From Software wanted this scene to be read. Unlike most significant corpses in the lands between, which frequently offer up an item, a memory, or at minimum a clear interaction prompt rewarding the player's attention, the crucified giant offers nothing mechanically at all. You can walk right up to it, stand beneath it, look up at the star directly above it, and the game gives you no system-level acknowledgement that anything significant is happening. This is, in its own way, a deliberate design choice as meaningful as anything textual. From Software clearly wanted this scene to function purely through visual and environmental storytelling, entirely unmediated by game mechanics, item pickups, or system prompts of any kind, which reinforces everything we discussed earlier about this being one of the purest examples of atmosphere-first design in the entire game. It's not a puzzle with a mechanical solution. It's an image, meant to be looked at, sat with, and puzzled over using nothing but your own capacity for interpretation, exactly the way you and I have been doing for the last hour of this video. I want to widen the lens one more time before we start bringing this analysis together, because there's a broader question worth asking that goes beyond just the blood star itself. Why does From Software keep doing this? Why build an entire studio identity around images this deliberately unresolved across game after game, when the vast majority of the industry treats ambiguity as a problem to be minimized rather than a tool to be cultivated? Part of the answer is mechanical and has to do with how these games are actually written. Miyazaki has spoken across numerous interviews over the years about drawing inspiration from Western fantasy literature he encountered as a child, in translations he didn't always fully understand, filling in the comprehension gaps with his own imagination, and has cited that experience directly as an influence on how he approaches storytelling in his own games. The theory, and it's one he's discussed fairly explicitly, is that a certain kind of productive incompleteness, information you have to actively work to complete yourself, creates a more personally resonant and more durably engaging experience than a fully spelled out narrative ever could. If that's the actual design philosophy driving these choices, and there's substantial reason to think it is, then the blood star isn't an oversight, isn't cut content that never got its explanatory text finished, isn't a loose thread the writing team simply forgot to tie off. It's a deliberate exercise in exactly the kind of productive incompleteness Miyazaki has built his entire directorial reputation around, scaled down to the size of a single object in a single region's sky. There's also a community design angle worth considering, one that's less about individual player experience and more about how these games function as ongoing cultural objects years after release. From Software's games maintain remarkably long tails of community engagement, active lore discussion, fan theorizing, and video essay production, precisely because they're structured to resist quick, complete resolution. A game that fully explains every mystery within its own text gets exhausted relatively quickly. Once the community reaches consensus on what everything means, the incentive to keep discussing it diminishes substantially. A game that deliberately leaves certain images, certain objects, certain corners of its world permanently and productively unresolved creates space for exactly the kind of sustained, years-long analytical engagement we're participating in right now, more than 4 years after this game's initial release, still finding new angles, new connections, new pieces of DLC content to fold into our understanding of a single star hanging over a single frozen mountain range. Whether or not that sustained engagement was a deliberately calculated business outcome, or simply an organic byproduct of a genuine artistic philosophy focused on ambiguity for its own sake, is impossible to know for certain. But the effect is the same either way these mysteries live, and continue generating value, discussion, and genuine intellectual engagement, specifically because they were never closed off. This is, I think, ultimately the most honest frame to view the Bloodstar through. Not as a puzzle with a hidden solution waiting to be uncovered by the right combination of item descriptions and careful cross-referencing, though we've done plenty of that throughout this video and I think it's genuinely valuable work, but as a piece of deliberately open-ended art, constructed with enough internal coherence and enough thematic weight to support serious, sustained interpretation, while never fully closing the loop on what it definitively means. The theories we've walked through, the Godwin connection, the Outer God signature, the giant sacrifice ritual, the Scarlet Rot resonance, the Maquella adjacent reading, the fringe possibilities involving Radon or an unnamed giant-specific cosmology, aren't competing attempts to find the one correct answer hidden somewhere in the game's files. They're all legitimate products of engaging seriously and carefully with a piece of art that was built from the ground up to reward exactly that kind of engagement without ever fully resolving into a single confirmed conclusion. Let's bring Ranni back into this conversation directly, because we've referenced her role in Godwin's death several times throughout this video without fully exploring her own relationship to stars, moons, and cosmic magic, and given how central she is to both the astrology-based sorcery system and to the specific weapon that killed Godwin. Her storyline deserves closer attention than we've given it so far. Ranni's entire questline revolves around rejecting the Golden Order's promised eternity in favor of what she calls the Age of Stars, a deliberately vague future she describes as cold, quiet, and free from the Greater Will's control entirely. This is significant for our purposes because Ranni is, structurally, the character in the entire game most directly associated with stars as a concept, more so than Sellen, more so than the Carrion royal family broadly, more so than anyone else we could point to. If any character in the Lands Between has the knowledge, the motive, and the cosmological understanding necessary to have caused, influenced, or at minimum understood the Bloodstar, it's her. And crucially, her own weapon, Fell Twin's blade empowered by the Rune of Death fragment, is the specific instrument that killed Godwin and set off the chain of events we spent an entire chapter connecting to the Bloodstar's likely origin. This raises a question the community has surprisingly not spent much time on directly. Is it possible the Bloodstar isn't merely a passive symptom of Godwin's death, but something closer to a direct expression of Ranni's own cosmic ambitions, deliberately or otherwise? Ranni's plan required orchestrating Godwin's death specifically because a fragment of destined death needed to enter the world in order to eventually shatter the Elden Ring and create the opportunity for her own ascension as the new vessel, governed by her preferred cosmology rather than the Greater Will's. If her actions, and the actions of her co-conspirators, were the proximate cause of the metaphysical rupture that created Godwin's unprecedented death, and if that rupture manifested visibly in the sky as the Bloodstar, there's a real argument to be made that Ranni herself, even indirectly, even as an unintended side effect of a plan aimed at something else entirely, is responsible for one of the most striking pieces of environmental imagery in the entire game, without the game ever drawing that line explicitly for us. This connection also gives us a slightly different way to think about the star's specific coloring and its relationship to the broader astrology magic system we discussed earlier. If Ranni's entire cosmological project is oriented around stars, cold, distant, quiet, freed from divine oversight, and if her actions inadvertently produced a star that is anything but cold and quiet, a star that pulses, that bleeds, that sits in visible, ongoing tension with the frozen stillness of everything around it, there's a poetic irony worth sitting with. The Bloodstar might represent the exact opposite of what Ranni's Age of Stars was supposed to bring into being. Not quiet, controlled. Intentional cosmic order, but a violent, uncontrolled wound torn into the sky as an unintended byproduct of the plan that was meant to produce that order in the first place. If that reading holds, the Bloodstar becomes almost a rebuke of Ranni's entire philosophy, proof that even the most carefully orchestrated cosmic ambition produces collateral damage its architect never fully accounts for, hanging permanently over the frozen north as a reminder of the cost nobody, including Ranni herself, ever chose to pay directly. I'll note that this is one of the more speculative extensions we've covered in this video, built on connecting Ranni's confirmed role in Godwin's death to the Godwin Bloodstar theory we ranked highly earlier, rather than on any direct textual evidence specifically linking Ranni to the star. But I think it's worth including because it demonstrates something valuable about how these theories can keep generating new interpretive angles, even after you think you've exhausted the obvious connections. Every named character whose storyline intersects with blood, death, or stars, even tangentially, becomes a new lens through which to re-examine this single object, and that's precisely the kind of durable, expandable mystery space From Software seems to have built here, deliberately or not. Let's spend a chapter on Malekith, because his role in this cosmology, as the original keeper of the Rune of Death before its fragment was ever used against Godwyn, gives us another important piece of context for understanding why an object connected to that rune's activation might manifest specifically as something blood-colored, rather than through some other visual language entirely. Malekith's entire storyline is built around the idea that destined death is not inherently evil or destructive, but catastrophically dangerous when unleashed without careful control, dangerous enough that an entire faction, the Blackblade cult under Malekith's own guardianship, existed for the sole purpose of keeping it sealed away from general use. Malekith himself is described, through his boss fight and surrounding lore, as gradually being consumed by the Rune of Death's influence over the centuries he spent guarding it, his own body increasingly wolf-like and beast, shaped as a physical manifestation of death's corrosive proximity, even on someone actively working to contain and control it, rather than deploy it. If prolonged proximity to destined death physically transforms even its intended guardian, someone whose entire purpose is safely managing that power, it stands to reason that its uncontrolled release into the world, however briefly, however localized to a single act of violence against a single person, could produce visible, lasting, physically manifesting consequences considerably beyond what a normal death in this setting would ever produce. This gives additional weight to the idea that Godwyn's death specifically, rather than any other death occurring throughout the game's long and violent history, would be uniquely capable of producing something as visually significant and as permanently unresolved as the Bloodstar. There's also a detail worth raising about color specifically, since we spent real time earlier in this video interrogating why the Bloodstar's shade doesn't map cleanly onto any of the game's other established blood sources. Malekith's own boss arena and the broader beast clergyman transformation he undergoes at the fight's midpoint is heavily associated with black, ashen, and dark red visual coding rather than the brighter, more saturated red we see in the Bloodstar itself. This is worth noting because it suggests that if Destined Death does have a consistent visual signature across the game, it's not a perfect match for what we see hanging over the mountaintops, which could mean the Bloodstar isn't a pure, unmediated expression of Destined Death itself, but rather blood, specifically Godwyn's blood, reacting to and being altered by contact with Destined Death, producing something visually distinct from either pure blood or pure death's own established color language on their own. That's a fine distinction, but I think it matters, because it suggests the Bloodstar isn't simply death made visible in the way Malekith's own transformation represents death's corrosive influence on a body. It's something closer to blood transformed by an encounter with death, a third, hybrid category the game doesn't otherwise show us directly anywhere else, which would make the Bloodstar genuinely unique within the game's established visual language for handling this specific type of metaphysical event, rather than simply another instance of an established pattern we could point to elsewhere. I want to briefly mention Fortisax here too, the crucified deathrite bird found not far from this same general region, because its presence adds one more data point to the pattern of significant unnatural deaths and unnatural preservations, clustering specifically around the mountaintops of the giants. Fortisax, like the giant, is displayed rather than simply killed, chained in a manner that echoes the crucifixion imagery we've spent considerable time discussing, and is directly, explicitly tied to Malekith's own storyline as a being closely associated with Destined Death's power. Having both Fortisax and the crucified giant within the same general region, both displayed in strikingly similar poses, both connected either directly or plausibly to Destined Death's influence, strengthens the overall case that this entire region of the map was deliberately designed as a kind of thematic cluster around death, its unnatural forms, and its visible, lasting consequences, with the Bloodstar functioning as the cluster's central unifying visual symbol hanging over all of it. I want to dedicate a chapter specifically to the skeptical position on all of this, because I think a genuinely thorough analysis owes real space to the argument that we, as a community, might simply be overreading a piece of environmental set dressing. And I don't want this video to feel like it's only interested in building the case rather than testing it. The skeptical position goes something like this. From Software's environment teams populate their worlds with an enormous number of striking, evocative visual details, far more than any single narrative thread could plausibly account for, and treating every one of them as a deliberate, deeply intentional piece of encoded lore risks over-interpreting what might, in a meaningful number of cases, simply be strong art direction serving mood rather than narrative. Under this view, the red coloring of the star might have been chosen primarily because it created a striking visual contrast against the region's otherwise blue-white, desaturated color palette, providing a useful focal point for the skybox and a memorable silhouette for promotional screenshots and cinematic framing, with the crucified giant beneath it serving a similar, primarily atmospheric function. A striking, memorable image meant to communicate this region has a violent, tragic history in the most economical way possible, without either element being intended to encode a specific, discoverable narrative explanation at all. I take this position seriously, and I don't think it can be fully dismissed, but I'd push back on it in a specific and, I think, fair way. The level of consistency we found across this video, the Church of Repose's death and rune magic thematically clustering around the same location, the broader pattern of crucifixion imagery reappearing meaningfully in Shadow of the Erdtree's Mesmer storyline, the specific and unusual coloring that doesn't map cleanly onto any single established in-game blood source, the deliberate absence of any interactive prompt that would normally accompany a purely decorative environmental detail. All of this is a lot of coincidental alignment for something that's just atmosphere with no deeper intentionality behind it. I think the more accurate position, and the one I'd actually defend rather than the more binary, it definitely means something specific framing, is that the Bloodstar almost certainly was designed with some genuine narrative intentionality behind it, given how consistently it clusters with other confirmed narrative elements, but that the specific singular meaning of that intentionality may never have been fully locked down even by the writing team itself, precisely because From Software's process, as far as we understand it from interviews and released concept material over the years, tends to prioritize evocative imagery and thematic resonance over rigidly pre-planned, fully worked out lore bibles for every single detail. In other words, it probably does mean something. It might not mean one single, cleanly definable thing. And the writing team may well have been comfortable leaving the exact specifics loose even in their own internal understanding, trusting the image's atmospheric and thematic coherence to carry the weight, rather than requiring a fully resolved, canonical explanation to exist somewhere in a design document we'll simply never see. This brings up a genuinely interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. What would it even look like for this mystery to be confirmed? If Shadow of the Erdtree, an entire expansion's worth of new content, didn't provide a direct explanation, what kind of future content plausibly could? A sequel set explicitly after these events, revisiting this exact region with new NPCs willing to discuss it directly, seems unlikely given how From Software has historically avoided direct narrative sequels to their major titles, preferring to build entirely new settings with looser, thematic rather than direct connective tissue to prior games. A remaster or definitive edition adding entirely new lore text to an existing static object seems almost unprecedented as a practice for this studio. Realistically, barring an unusually direct statement from Miyazaki himself in some future interview, which he has occasionally given for other, similarly ambiguous pieces of lore across his catalog when pressed directly enough by journalists over the years, this mystery is very likely to remain in exactly the state we've analyzed it in throughout this entire video, richly theorized, internally consistent across multiple compelling readings, and never definitively closed. Let's talk for a moment about the actual experience of encountering this for the first time, because I think it's worth acknowledging just how effective this piece of design is purely on a visceral level, independent of any of the deep lore analysis we've spent the last 2 hours working through, because that visceral effectiveness is itself evidence of just how carefully this moment was constructed. The Mountaintops of the Giants is, for most players, encountered relatively late in a typical playthrough, after dozens of hours spent across Limgrave, Liurnia, Caelid, and the Altus Plateau, regions that, despite their individual horrors, mostly operate within a recognizable, if strange, fantasy visual language. The transition into the mountaintops is deliberately disorienting. The color palette shifts dramatically toward cold blues and stark whites. The music, where it exists at all in this comparatively sparse region, becomes thinner and more distant. And then, somewhere in the middle of trudging through waist-deep snow, fighting off giant skeletons and frost-touched enemies, the player looks up and sees a small, dull red light hanging in a sky that has, up to this point, largely avoided drawing attention to itself, It's easy to miss on a first pass, and I think that's intentional too. This isn't a boss introduction cutscene. It's not accompanied by a swelling musical cue or a forced camera pan. It's the kind of detail that rewards players who happen to look up at the right moment, in the right weather conditions, from the right angle, which means a meaningful percentage of players who've completed the game never actually notice it at all during their own playthrough, only encountering it later through exactly the kind of video essay you're watching right now. That's worth sitting with, because it changes how we should think about the Bloodstar's function within the broader game. It's not load-bearing for anyone's understanding of the main plot. You can finish Elden Ring entirely, defeat every major boss, complete every major questline, and never once notice this detail exists. Its entire value proposition is additive rather than essential, a reward specifically for players who slow down, who look up, who treat the world itself as worth examining independent of whatever quest marker or boss encounter they're currently pursuing. This is, I'd argue, one of the purest expressions of what makes From Software's approach to environmental storytelling so distinct from most of the rest of the industry. Plenty of games include optional lore for dedicated players to find. Far fewer games build entire, richly theorizable mysteries into details this small, this easy to overlook, this disconnected from any mechanical reward or progression gate. The Bloodstar exists purely for the players willing to look for it. And I think that's exactly the kind of design philosophy that's produced the sustained multi-year analytical community this video is itself a product of. There's a broader pattern here too, one that extends well beyond just this one object. From Software's games are consistently more rewarding to players who treat exploration itself as the primary activity, rather than treating the world as a backdrop for combat encounters and quest completion. The Bloodstar is a perfect test case for this philosophy because it offers, quite literally, nothing mechanically. No item, no boss, no shortcut, no stat boost, nothing that a min-maxing efficiency-focused playthrough would ever have reason to seek out. Its only reward is the reward of noticing, of wondering, of building and testing theories about what it might mean. Exactly the process we've spent this entire 2 hours walking through together. In a sense, this single object is a distilled thesis statement for From Software's entire design philosophy across every game they've made since Demon's Souls. The world itself is the primary text, mechanical systems are secondary, and the players who slow down enough to actually look at what's around them are the ones who get access to the richest, strangest, most rewarding layer of everything these games have to offer. Let's ask one more question before we start bringing everything together, because it's a question that's been sitting underneath this entire video without ever getting fully isolated on its own. Why blood, specifically, rather than any of the other substances and colors this setting associates with cosmic significance? Elden Ring gives us gold, associated with the Erd Tree and the Golden Order's authority. It gives us the deep, near-black purple of the Frenzied Flame's corruption. It gives us the sickly orange of Scarlet Rot. It gives us the pale, near-white color the Erd Tree itself takes on following the Shattering. Of all of these established color languages, the developers specifically chose blood red for this one, singular, unexplained star, and I think that choice deserves to be interrogated directly rather than simply accepted as a given. Blood, across nearly every From Software title, carries a specific and consistent thematic weight distinct from these other substances. It's the one substance in these games that's simultaneously the most mundane. Present in literally every living creature, human, beast, and demigod alike, and the most potentially transformative, capable, under the right ritual or magical conditions, of granting power, transmitting corruption, enabling transformation, or serving as a medium for the most intimate, most personal kind of sacrifice imaginable. Gold, in this setting, represents institutional, inherited, top-down authority, power that flows from the Erd Tree downward through a hierarchy. The Frenzied Flame represents power gained through total, often involuntary submission to something beyond comprehension. Blood occupies a different category entirely. It's power that's already inside you, that you already possess. That requires no external grant of authority or hierarchy to access, only the willingness to spend it, to spill it, to offer it up. If the Bloodstar represents any of the theories we've discussed throughout this video, Godwin's death, the giant's sacrifice, and Outer God's signature, the choice of blood as the specific medium carries a consistent implication across every single one of them. Whatever happened here didn't come from institutional top-down authority. It came from something personal, something bodily, something that required an individual, whether Godwin or the crucified giant, to actually give something of themselves, rather than simply being granted power from an external hierarchical source. That consistency, I think, is the strongest unifying thread running underneath every theory we've examined in this video. Stronger even than any single piece of textual evidence we've cited along the way. Every reading we've built, however much they differ on the specific mechanism, the specific cause, the specific entity ultimately responsible, agrees on this one underlying point. The blood star represents cost, not granted power, not institutional authority. Cost, paid personally, paid in blood, by someone or something specific, whether that's Godwin's unprecedented and unwilling death, the giant's desperate and possibly willing sacrifice, or some outer god's ongoing, active claim on a fragment of the world it's found a way to reach into. Whatever the precise mechanism, and I think we've made a genuinely strong case throughout this video for the Godwin and giant sacrifice readings specifically, the underlying emotional and thematic core of this single object in the sky is remarkably consistent no matter which specific theory you ultimately land on. Something, or someone, paid dearly for whatever this star represents. And the sky itself has never stopped bearing witness to that cost. Let's return one more time to Moog and the Formless Mother, because I think there's a synthesis available here that we didn't fully draw out earlier in this video. One that connects the cost, paid in blood through line we just established directly back to the specific mechanics of how blood functions as a magical medium throughout Moog's own storyline. Moog's entire arc is built around a specific recurring idea, that blood, sufficiently concentrated, sufficiently ritually prepared, and offered to the right entity under the right conditions, can serve as a kind of currency, capable of purchasing outcomes that wouldn't otherwise be available through conventional means. His attempted transformation of Maquella, his cultivation of an entire hidden dynasty built around blood ritual and blood worship, his boss arena's massive blood geyser, all of it operates on this same underlying logic. Blood is payment. And payment, offered correctly, buys access to something beyond what conventional Golden Order mechanics would normally allow. If we take this as an established rule within the game's own internal magic system, rather than something unique to Moog specifically, it gives us a cleaner mechanical framework for understanding how any of the theories we've discussed throughout this video could actually function. Under this framework, the Bloodstar isn't just thematically about cost in some abstract, poetic sense. It's mechanically about cost, in the same literal transactional sense that governs Moog's entire relationship with the Formless Mother. Something was offered, something was purchased. The star is the receipt, permanently displayed in the sky for anyone who knows how to read it. This reframing helps unify several of our strongest theories, in a way I think is worth spelling out explicitly. If the giants offered the crucified individual as payment specifically to protect the primeval flame, that's a transaction, structurally identical to Moog's own relationship with the Formless Mother, just aimed at a different entity and a different desired outcome. If Godwin's death, and the subsequent spread of Deathroot throughout the lands between, represents an unintended, catastrophic cost paid involuntarily rather than offered deliberately, that's still a transaction in the sense that something of enormous value, in this case a demigod's soul and his place within the natural cycle of death and rebirth, was extracted from the world, and never fully returned, with the Bloodstar serving as the visible record of that extraction. Even the outer god theory fits this framework naturally, an entity reaching into the world through blood, taking or claiming something in exchange for whatever influence it exerts, is functionally identical to the transactional logic Moog's entire storyline establishes as a real, mechanically consistent feature of this setting's magic. Every theory we've discussed, in other words, can be read as a variation on the same underlying mechanic, blood as currency, spent or extracted in exchange for an outcome, with the Bloodstar as this specific transaction's permanent, visible mark. I find this framing genuinely useful because it gives us a way to hold all of these competing theories in mind simultaneously without needing to fully resolve which one is definitively correct. They're not really competing explanations for a single event. They're different instances of the same underlying transactional logic applied to different specific circumstances, different specific parties, and different specific outcomes, all converging on the same visible result, a star that shouldn't exist, burning red in a sky that otherwise gives no indication of the enormous, costly transactions that have shaped the history of everything beneath it. Let's take a step back and think about what this entire exercise says about how we, as an analytical community, should approach the dozens of other unexplained details still scattered throughout Elden Ring's world because I don't think the Blood Star is actually unique in the sense of being From Software's only object built along these exact lines. It's simply one of the most visually striking, most accessible examples of a technique the studio has used, in smaller and larger forms, throughout the entire game. If you start looking for it, once you've spent 2 hours the way we have here, tracing a single unexplained image through cosmology, item text, cross-title comparison, and DILT content, you start noticing similar unresolved details everywhere across the lands between. The specific significance of the many, varied crystal formations scattered throughout Liurnia, beyond their obvious connection to the Carian royal family's magic, remains largely unaddressed by direct text. The exact nature and origin of the Deathbirds, the strange robed figures found guarding specific locations throughout the map, connected to Fortisax and to Destined Death, but never fully explained as their own distinct phenomenon. The specific mechanics and full implications of the Frenzied Flames spread through certain NPCs versus others, why some characters succumb to it, while others in seemingly identical circumstances don't. Each of these, and dozens of others we don't have time to cover in this video, represent the exact same design pattern we've spent this entire 2 hours examining, enough textual and environmental anchoring to support serious, rigorous analysis, combined with a deliberate refusal to ever fully close the loop on a single confirmed answer. I think the most valuable thing this kind of deep dive analysis can offer, beyond just working through the specific theories for one specific object, is a template for how to approach this entire category of From Software's design. Take the image seriously as intentional. Look for genuine patterns of thematic and geographic clustering rather than isolated, one-off connections. Weigh the evidence honestly rather than reaching for whichever theory sounds most dramatic. Be willing to hold multiple compatible readings simultaneously, rather than forcing a single answer where the game itself seems to resist providing one. And, maybe most importantly, resist the urge to treat we can't fully confirm this as a failure of the analysis rather than an accurate reflection of what these games are actually doing. The Blood Star was never going to have a clean, singular, textually confirmed answer, and I'd argue that's true of most of From Software's best environmental mysteries. The value isn't in finally solving them, it's in the quality and rigor of the process you use to engage with them, which is ultimately exactly what we've spent the last 2 hours doing together. So where does that leave us after everything we've covered? Let's actually pull this together into something resembling a final, synthesized position, acknowledging everything we've weighed against everything else throughout this video, rather than just leaving all of these threads scattered. The strongest case, built from the largest number of independently confirmed textual pillars, points toward the Blood Star being fundamentally connected to Godwin's death and its unprecedented rupture of the Golden Order's cycle of death and rebirth. A metaphysical wound severe enough to manifest visibly not just through the ground-level spread of Deathroot we see documented throughout the base game, but through the sky itself, in a region already established, through the Church of Repose and its rune and gravity sorceries, as thematically clustered around death, cosmology, and the mechanics of rebirth. Layered on top of that foundation, the crucified giant beneath the star most likely represents either a desperate ritual sacrifice offered by the giants themselves in a doomed attempt to protect the primeval flame as their numbers dwindled toward extinction, or in Shadow of the Erd Tree's expanded crucifixion imagery around Mesmer meaningfully shifts the balance toward this reading. A punishment or display inflicted on the giants from outside by an earlier, more brutal iteration of Erdtree adjacent power hostile to anything and anyone standing in the way of the Golden Order's rise. Both readings remain live. The DLC content tilts the scale without fully resolving it, running alongside and reinforcing this foundation. The Outer God framework gives us a coherent explanation for why this phenomenon would be permanent, singular, and visually distinct from every other established blood source in the game, consistent with how Outer Gods function elsewhere in this cosmology as ongoing, active presences rather than historical artifacts. And beneath all of these more specific readings sits the broader, unifying thematic pattern we spent the last several chapters establishing. Blood, throughout this entire setting, functions as currency, as cost, as payment extracted or offered in exchange for outcomes that exist outside the Golden Order's normal, sanctioned channels of power. Whatever specific transaction the Blood Star represents, whoever paid it and whoever or whatever received that payment. The underlying logic holds consistent across every theory we've examined. Something was given, something was taken, and the sky above the mountaintops of the giants has never stopped bearing witness to it. I want to spend some time now on how this analysis might actually change the way you experience the mountaintops of the giants if you go back and replay through it with everything we've discussed in mind. Because I think that's ultimately the most useful, practical takeaway a video like this can offer, beyond just the theorizing itself. If you load up a save file near the mountaintops right now, or start a fresh playthrough with the intention of paying closer attention to the specific region, I'd encourage you to notice a few things you might have walked past before. Notice how the Church of Repose's location relative to the crucified giant isn't incidental, how the sorcery's taught there. Gravity magic capable of crushing and displacing, rune magic tied directly to the mechanics of death and rebirth, sit in direct visual and thematic conversation, with the body hanging beneath the star nearby. Notice the broader silence of the region compared to earlier areas of the game, how the environmental audio design strips away nearly everything except wind and your own footsteps in the snow, creating a kind of enforced stillness that makes an object like the Bloodstar land with far more weight than it would in a busier, more populated region.